It is the year 1341. A royal officer rides into your French village and reads out an order that will outlast your grandchildren. From this day, the salt in your kitchen belongs to the king. It sounds almost too small to matter. You could hold a fistful of it and feel nothing but cold grains slipping between your fingers. Yet steal that powder, smuggle it, or sell it without paying the crown, and you could be branded, chained to the oar of a galley, or hanged in the village square. Why would a kingdom kill its own people over a pinch of salt? And how did the most ordinary thing on the medieval table become one of the most dangerous substances in Europe? Welcome to Reason Found. Today, we are tracing the strange and bloody story of medieval salt and the reasons hiding in plain sight. To understand why a king would gamble lives on salt, you have to step into a world stripped of almost everything we lean on. No refrigerators, no freezers, no tins, no supermarkets, no way to stop food rotting once the warm months passed. In that world, salt was not a flavor, it was survival itself. Salt was the single thing that could hold back decay, so medieval families packed their meat in it, buried their fish and butter and cheese in it, and prayed it would carry them through to spring. Fall short before winter ended, and the arithmetic turned brutal. A full larder in October could still leave you with an empty grave by March. Whole institutions ran on the stuff, an army on the march, a besieged town, fishing fleets gone for months at sea. None of them lasted long without barrels of salted provisions, which is exactly why people nicknamed salt white gold. The salted herring and dried cod that fed Europe through Lent only reached the table because someone, somewhere, had cured it in enough salt. And salt did not fall evenly from the sky. Coastal villages raked it straight out of the sea as coarse grey bay salt, while landlocked towns paid through the nose to haul every grain overland along the old salt roads. The wealthy hoarded it the way later men would hoard gold bars. One 13th century English bishop, so the records claim, stockpiled enough salt at a single manor to fill an entire room. Picture it, a whole room given to nothing but the grains that decided whether a household feasted or starved. Salt already carried enormous power, but what the peasants grinding it into their bread hadn't yet grasped was that the same grain was about to decide something far more personal, exactly where they belonged in the order of the world. Here is the first thing salt quietly governed: your place at the table. Step into a great medieval hall during a feast, and near the center of the high table, you would spot a single object the whole room kept glancing at: a large, ornately worked silver vessel holding the household salt. They called it the Great Salt. Where you sat in relation to it was a public verdict on how much you mattered. Sit between the host and that vessel, and everyone understood you were a person of rank. You sat, in a phrase that still survives, above the salt. Get steered past it, down towards the smoke and clatter of the kitchen, and the message landed just as hard. You were below the salt, and below the salt is where the lesser guests, the poor relations, and the servants ate. The vessels themselves swelled into ridiculous declarations of wealth. King Charles V of France owned a collection of roughly 46 of them by 1378, and he would set several in front of honored guests purely to untangle who outranked whom. Think about what that meant. A man's importance, his honor, his standing in front of everyone he knew, all of it could pivot on which side of a salt dish he was waved towards. And rulers refused to leave this pecking order to custom alone. They wrote it into law. Across medieval Europe, a web of rules we now call the peasant sumptuary laws dictated how each class could dress, eat, and parade its wealth. And England's Diet and Apparel Act of 1363 policed not just dress, but what commoners could pile on the table. The real luxuries, though, were never salt alone, but the spices sitting beside it. Pepper, saffron, and cinnamon cost small fortunes, and the peasant sumptuary laws made certain a poor family could never legally show them off like a lord. Salt fed you, salt preserved you, and now salt and spice ranked you in the eyes of the law itself. But this was only the beginning, because the story does not stay locked inside those halls. It walked out with us, and it hides in words you say without thinking. That obsession never really died. It slipped into everyday language and stayed there. Call someone respectable today, and you might still say they are above the salt. Doubt that a worker has earned their wage, and you grumble that they are not worth their salt. Even the word salary may reach back to the same root, the Latin salarium, a soldier's allowance long tied to salt, though scholars still argue how literal that link ever was. The grains left their fingerprints on the map too. Whole cities climbed out of salt. Venice grew fabulously rich, gripping the salt trade across the Mediterranean. The Austrian city of Salzburg still wears the word in its very name, which means, near enough, the Salt Castle and German towns like Lüneburg stayed wealthy for centuries on the white seams running beneath their streets. That harmless shaker beside your plate descends quietly from something monarchs schemed and fought to control, and that is exactly where the story darkens. Once a king grasps that his people cannot live without a thing, he also grasps that he can squeeze them through it. France worked this out more ruthlessly than anyone. There is one final piece of this story that almost no one knows. So far, two forces had policed the salt: the peasant sumptuary laws that decided who could flaunt it, and plain price, which decided who could afford it. France bolted on a third, with a name the country would loathe for 400 years, the gabelle, its logic chilled in its simplicity. If every person needs salt to live, and every person has to buy it, then whoever owns the salt owns everyone. So the crown seized it outright. A temporary salt duty under King Louis IX hardened, in 1341, into a permanent royal tax under King Philip VI, then bolted into place by ordinance 2 decades on. Salt belonged to the king now, and the king meant to profit. By law, almost everyone over the age of 8 had to buy a fixed ration of salt each year, around 15 pounds of it, at whatever swollen price the crown named. Refusal was not an option. Worse, the weight fell unequally. Nobles, clergy, and a handful of favoured towns dodged the tax completely, while the poorest shouldered all of it. Cross a provincial border only a few miles wide, and the price might leap many times over, which lit a fuse under the entire kingdom. Salt smuggling, faux saunage, became one of the most common crimes in the land, and the punishments were savage. Caught smuggling unarmed, you could be chained to a galley oar for years. Carry a weapon, though, and you could hang. The fury boiled over again and again, most violently in 1548, when thousands rose in open revolt and cut down the king's tax collectors before the crown replied with the noose. By the eve of the French Revolution, courts were condemning more than 3,000 men, women, and children to prison or death every single year, all of it over salt. So when the people finally drew up their grievances in 1789, the gabelle sat near the top of the list, and 32 of its tax collectors would later meet the guillotine. The hated tax died in 1790, 4 centuries and a revolution after a king first claimed the salt in a peasant's kitchen. So the next time you reach across the table for the salt, hold it a second longer. That careless pinch between your fingers was once worth more than gold. It preserved the winters that kept whole villages breathing. It decided who was honored and who was shamed at dinner. It built cities, handed them their names, and packed prison cells and galley benches across an entire kingdom. What you barely notice, they would have guarded with their lives, because for them, more often than not, it was their lives. I find it quietly humbling that the most ordinary thing in the kitchen once carried that much weight, and that we have forgotten nearly all of it. If this is the kind of hidden history you enjoy, think about subscribing to Reason Found for more of the reasons hiding in plain sight. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next one.